Yet again, The Mandalorian has surprised us with its most recent episode, taking upon itself to show us sides of the Star Wars universe that we hadn't previously considered. This week, the side we got a closer look at was the dark side. This most recent episode gave us a closer look at an Imperial remnant, and in doing so gave us a more sympathetic view of the average stormtrooper than we're used to. It was a solemn reminder that not everyone fighting for the Empire was a Sith Lord or a genocidal maniac. There were plenty of rank and files that, all things considered, weren't all that evil. This, of course, begs a question. Why on earth did they support the Empire so fervently?
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The Galactic Empire was evil. In light of all the genocide and oppression that the Empire perpetrated, there are no two ways around that fact. Even the good things the Imperial State did came with some pretty hefty strings attached, and it's the main antagonistic faction in the Star Wars universe for a reason. But that doesn't mean that every single person that fought for the Empire was a sadistic sack of Sith. There were a lot of decent people in the ranks of the Imperial Army, Imperial Navy, and even the Imperial Stormtrooper Corps. Many of them even shared the same moral values and beliefs with the average supporter of the rebellion. Why then did they support the Empire? If we had to answer that question in one word, that would be censorship. The Empire was a totalitarian state, one that had full control of most of the galaxy for over 20 years. It nationalized all media services, rewrote the history books, and harshly stifled freedom of speech in a bid to control common narratives, and that bid was wildly successful. The Mandalorian has given us a number of glimpses into just how successful Imperial censorship and propaganda campaigns had been. Consider, for example, that virtually nobody knows anything about the Jedi only 30 years after the Order's fall. When Palpatine rose to power, one of the first things he did was do his best to erase the Jedi from galactic consciousness, and he clearly did a good job of it. The Jedi weren't the only subjects the Empire censored either. Far from it. The Empire rewrote history to diminish the contributions of non-human species and the threat posed by organizations like the Sith, changing the story of the galaxy in a way that, they believed, would make the average person more willing to support them. Imperial censors also made sure that the only ones who knew about the Empire's many crimes against civilization were officers and those who were actively involved. For the vast majority of beings in the galaxy, the destruction of Alderaan was the first Imperial crime that they actually heard about, after 19 long years of the Empire wiping out populations, devastating worlds, and enslaving entire species. Most Imperial grunts just didn't have the full picture. By the time of the Galactic Civil War, most rank and file stormtroopers either had no memories of the time before the Empire or very faint memories, and almost all of them had grown up under Imperial censorship. Virtually everyone their age had been indoctrinated to see the Empire as a good thing, and a lot of people just didn't know enough to question that. For those who never knew anything different, a lack of certain human rights didn't strike them as something the Empire was doing to them, per se. The day-to-day downsides of the Empire were just seen as the way things are, unless you were in a position to know firsthand how horrible the Empire actually was. If you're feeling a bit skeptical of all that, consider this. In today's Mando episode, didn't you root for the Empire, if only for a few seconds, when those TIE fighters came in and strafed the pirates? Didn't you feel vaguely celebratory when all those stormtroopers were cheering for Din and Mayfeld? Consider how just the presentation of those quick scenes made you feel just a little bit more positively inclined toward the Empire. The Empire shoved those sorts of scenes down the throats of its citizens every night on Imperial Holovision, and thus, it's no wonder why so many young stormtroopers were so dedicated to it. This episode gave us a glimpse of another reason why so many people wholeheartedly supported the Empire: the propaganda line that the Empire embodied order. In its first years, The Empire consolidated support for itself by playing off memories of the Clone Wars, referring to all who opposed Imperial rule as separatists. The Empire depicted itself as a bastion of order and security, waging an endless war against separatism and chaos, making not so subtle references to General Grievous whenever public sympathy for rebel movements started to grow, reminding Imperial citizens what had happened the last time such things were allowed to run amok in the galaxy. This tactic was extremely effective, at least while the memory of the Clone Wars was still fresh in most beings' minds, and even after it faded, the notion of the Empire as the embodiment of order was still quite pervasive, even after the rise of the New Republic. Furthermore, a majority of stormtroopers and Imperial Army recruits came from the core colonies and Inner Rim, the wealthier parts of the galaxy that, under the Empire, became even more prosperous than they had been under the Republic. This wealth, of course, came from the brutal exploitation of the Rim, but few people living in those sectors saw that. All they saw was the Empire making their homeworlds richer. Many of them didn't know much at all about the Outer Rim territories, and wouldn't get their first look at how bad things were out there until they'd already donned the armor. All told, a lot of young Imperial citizens were indoctrinated to believe that the Empire was a force for good. The biggest reason many of them had for joining the Imperial military was to go out to the Rim and make a difference, to fight for freedom, as it were. This was true for many young Imperial citizens living out the Rim as well. Remember that even Luke Skywalker dreamed of entering the Imperial Academy right up until the stormtroopers burned his home to the ground. The vast majority of Imperial recruits had fair reasons for wanting to sign on with the Empire. None of them knew that their job descriptions might include them committing war crimes. News of Imperial atrocities were suppressed, after all, even within the ranks of the Stormtrooper Corps. It should be added that those Imperials who found out about the crimes of their government had a habit of defecting to the rebellion. This was the case for Crix Madine and Biggs Darklighter, for example. Notably, the reasons many Imperial soldiers originally had for joining the Empire were quite similar to the reasons that people signed on with the Alliance to restore the Republic when it became a thing. Combatants on both sides of the Galactic Civil War believed that they were fighting for freedom, to make a real difference and stop the spread of evil in the galaxy. Many Imperial soldiers even believed in many of the ideals of the rebellion and had just been deceived to the point where they believed the Empire upheld them. There were, of course, some genuinely evil people within the Empire as well. The average Imperial officer knew of and was largely okay with the various atrocities carried out by the Empire, and many of them were fully committed to the lie of Imperial order. The Mandalorian showed us this side of the Empire too, in the form of that creepy officer who was praising Operation Cinder. This actually ended up being the Empire's downfall. These officers were power hungry, as a rule, and always competed with each other, creating inefficiencies in the Imperial war machine in doing so, and after Endor, they turned on each other, fragmenting the Empire and allowing the New Republic to take over. But those types weren't the majority in the military, even in the Stormtrooper Corps. Most Imperial loyalists were just heavily indoctrinated, dedicated to supposed Imperial ideals that the Empire didn't really care for. When service to the Empire made them confront this reality, many of them attempted to rationalize the contradictions away, coming up with justifications to allow themselves to sleep at night. When this didn't work, many jumped ship and joined the rebellion. So that's why the average Imperial was so loyal to the Empire, in spite of everything the Empire had done to harm the galaxy. But what do you think? Would you like to see us more talk about the Empire in the future? Let us know in the comment section below. And just before you abandon me, guys, make sure you check out some of those links in the description below, including our Patreon if you want to access our behind the scenes Discord, where you can chat to myself and the entire team that makes these videos. Also check out our Relax Jack music channel, where you can use the songs we used in this video and a lot of our recent videos for your own creative projects, and just our wider Geetsly's community on our main Geetsly's Discord server and our Geetsly's gaming network. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.